Well, we all know that public service is critical for our country. The question is Canada's public service, that is elected and non-elected, is it broken? Well, that's the question we're going to talk about today with our next guest. With me here today is Dorothy Dobbie, a former MP for Winnipeg South and business person and author. And she's also the author of a report that was done with Frontier entitled Restoring Accountability, Fixing Canada's Public Administration. And I wanted to congratulate you on the report, your analysis, Dorothy. I thought it was very thoughtful and insightful about a topic that we typically don't talk about. And so my first question to you would be, why did you think it was timely to talk about public service in our country?
Why was it timely? Well, there's so much going on. There's so much confusion. There seems to be a lack of accountability. I feel that some of the ministers and at every level of government, those who are responsible, are powerless. They don't seem to have the sense of responsibility. In fact, it's very interesting because I heard from a former minister from Manitoba the other day on another piece I wrote, and he said, was a former NDP minister, and he said, I'm very glad to see the story you wrote about small c conservatism. He said, in my own party, I wonder whatever happened to the word responsible in the NDP. And that doesn't just extend to the NDP. I think there's a lot of that feeling that there's nobody in charge, and that the sense of responsibility that was given to us as members of parliament or as members of the legislature is something that we no longer have any control over. And that is affecting everything we do, and it's affecting how we are governed.
Okay, so a key theme is accountability. I think as members of the public, we assume that when we vote for our elected representatives, that they're in fact in charge. And I thought it was interesting that from the report that you said, basically the system, you state that Canada's public service, once a global model of professionalism, has been hijacked by political operatives and rigid union rules that prioritize power over public service. Career bureaucrats have been replaced by political insiders and unqualified appointees, while layers of inefficient management, slow decision making drive up costs. So, it's a pretty hard-hitting kind of report and insight. And you actually say this is kind of a threat to good governance in Canada. So what do you mean by that?
I mean, it's a threat to democracy. I mean, we are based on our system is responsible government. That's why I use that word, which means that the minister or the member of parliament or whoever it is responsible for the decisions that are taken and the actions that are taken. And when we abrogate the responsibility, the accountability for that, we have no democracy, because you have to be, the accountability is if you don't do your job, if things don't go right, you lose your job, you lose the election, somebody else comes in. And when you have no real power over how those decisions are made, that there's lip service paid to the minister or perhaps the legislator, it means that they don't really know what's going on. They're just following the dictates of people in the back room who are not elected, who have their own biases and their own views, and who deliver the information to the person who is accountable as if it was the gospel, as if that was the only answer. And we have all these rules that say you can't lobby, as if lobbying is a bad thing. I mean, that's what we do as citizens. If we see an elected representative, the first thing we do is we want to tell them what we think. And that's a good thing. But that minister or that citizen or that representative needs to be able to speak to everybody, hear what everybody says, listen to it carefully. You've got the time to do this job because that's what you're elected to do. You don't have anything else to worry about, and make decisions that are based on a lot of information, not just one pipeline.
Okay, so help us understand then the basics around this situation then, because you say that, well, for instance, political staff interfere with that kind of direct dynamic between elected officials and how things get done. So what do you mean by political staff?
Well, at one time, each minister, each member of parliament hired their own member, their own staff member, their own chief of staff, their own, supporters. And they still do in constituencies, but in the federal parties and in the provincial party where I come from, It is no longer the job of the minister to hire his own staff member. The PMO in Ottawa or the premier's office in one of the provinces does the hiring. It's like a little hiring agency. And in Manitoba, then I not only do the hiring, but they also in the past government switched if somebody changed the portfolio, they didn't leave your chief of staff with you. They kept him there because he's the guy that knows everything, and moved you to another portfolio who you're supposed to be getting information from another chief of staff. How does that help you? You have to be able to relate to the department. You have to be able to relate directly to the deputy minister. If you think about some of the things that have happened in the past year or so, where ministers at the federal level have said, we didn't know. Well, I didn't know. I believe him. I believe him absolutely. And I think when we hear from Robert, we'll hear why. Because they weren't told. There was information that was available for the minister, and it wasn't passed on because this unelected person is saying, we don't
let's just
do that.
Hold this for a sec here. So you're saying that if there's an elected official, let's take this as an example, say the Minister of Natural Resources, the public would assume that the staff, the political staff around his office, are people that he or she may relate to and he knows well and works well, when in fact, that's all been flipped on its head, where the Premier's office or the Prime Minister's office, the PMO, as you said, parachute all those people in and they report back to that central office. So that office is you're saying, it basically undermines any of that kind of autonomy or power of the minister. It's all centralized. Is that what you're saying?
It centralizes power in the office of the premier, the prime minister, the mayor in some cases. And it means that the individual who has been charged with the responsibility, and it's kind of interesting because this morning we're hearing the swearing in of new ministers, they don't really have any power. And in fact, I can give you a direct quote from a former minister in this particular government who once heard her chief of staff being approached by a new person in the office saying, I have some information for the minister. I need to take it to her right away. And the answer was, give it to me, from the chief of staff. We only tell her what she needs to know. She overheard this. I said, why didn't you fire them? She said, I can't. They were hired by the prime minister's office. She had no power. So she said when she was there, she built her own little place and then did her own little thing because she really didn't know what was going on in the global picture.
Okay, so a lot of this power has been centralized to, well, in the case of provinces, the premier, or in the case of the federal government, to the prime minister. So that's a challenge, because a lot of the public thinks, well, the ministers are important representatives as well as my MP, when in fact so much of this power is centralized. Another point you make is union overreach. What do you mean by that?
Well, first, let me just go back quickly to also the bureaucracy. So I guess that takes us back into the union side. So you normally, under normal circumstances, you would talk to your deputy minister and perhaps a few officials from his department or her department in order to get a really strong picture of what the pros and cons are of any particular policy.
And I should just clarify, because I don't think people would necessarily understand this. A deputy minister is kind of like the top bureaucrat reporting to the minister who's elected. Is that it?
Yes, exactly. And the people that work in that department and the senior management levels report to him. He ultimately reports to the chief of the Privy Council or whoever it happens to be, whatever the jurisdiction calls it. But they also have to report to the minister because the minister is responsible. And so in the case, what I see happening now is that often the information gets stopped at the chief of staff. They tell him what the minister needs to know because the minister is not there. And it seems to have become habitual in some circumstances. So, but when we come back to the union thing, which is a slightly different question, this, as I said at the very outset, the public service was, the sort of the epitome of good governance around the world. And I've been to many countries where they still believe that, because people were independent public servants. They were there for the good of the country and had pride in what they did because they were making a difference. And they were using their judgment and thinking critically to deal with issues that they could take forward to the political people and say, here are the pros and cons, and what do you think we should do, minister? And instead of that happening in the last number of years, as the unions have tightened their hold over the system, and it becomes harder and harder to fire anybody. In fact, they're told, oh, you can't fire me. Well, you can, but you have to suffer the consequences, which is usually a big financial penalty. But there's this sense that no, they're sacrosanct, and the only way you can deal with them is if you can't work with them is to move them to another department. Often it entails, believe it or not, a promotion so that it's acceptable for them to move, and that just creates a bigger problem. What it means is that those who are in the civil service, and there are many, many like this, we're still very fortunate to have dedicated, really career-minded, interested people who want to serve, but who find that they can't rise past a certain level, because there's that ceiling that says, if you stick your head up, it's like the great Canadian game called Whack-A-Mole. I'm sure you've seen that in the West Edmonton Mall. You bang down the guy that pops up. That happens in union situations. By the way, I'm not against unions. I was married to a union representative for 52 years. But it does happen. There's a sort of a leveling factor, and it means that excellence isn't allowed to pop up above and bubble up and start to, create new ideas and bring in innovation. In government, that was okay for a while, but it doesn't work for over the long term, because you begin to reduce the capability of our public service. And certainly you will reduce the sense of initiative and innovation and responsibility. And that's not good for the country.
Right on. So it sounds like it's become more and more a dysfunctional system where we think we elect people to be in charge, but in fact, their power has been undermined and centralized. And on the other hand, we need very good servants in the bureaucracy, the unelected part, but that's undermined by a dominant union culture that frankly sees seniority as the key and not necessarily merit. And it's almost impossible to fire these persons now. Is that what you're getting at?
That's one of the issues. Another issue is that often as the government comes to its end, and usually that's at the end of the second term, or if they've been clever like this government, to get 3 terms out of it by calling snap elections. And many of your people, if you think it's coming to the end, and they're pretty smart, they generally know, they second themselves into the public service. So now we have a public service that is probably very much, especially if the government's there a long time, polarized in one direction, which is the former government. So they're biased. They have a political interest at heart, and that doesn't help the situation, because when the new government comes in, and often with no corporate memory, if they haven't been in for a long, long time, it takes quite a long time for them to figure out how to, how things work and how to make things actually happen. And they have to trust in those public servants to give them the information that's accurate and non-political, non-partisan, totally, independently thinking. And that doesn't always happen, David.
So are you saying that the bureaucratic side of government, the civil servants, are in many cases being politicized then? That they're losing their neutrality?
Yes.
So why does that matter to Canadians?
It happens probably in other governments too. I'm sure it happens in other places. But listen, our job as citizens is to know what's going on and to guard against these things and to prevent them. So one thing to do is there's a moratorium against public servants going into lobbying. I think it's 3 years. Well, maybe there's a way to deal with that in terms of entering the public service. If you're a chief of staff, or if you're a highly placed political person, then maybe you shouldn't be able to enter the public service for some time. There's the same thing that goes for what we often see also at the very, very outset, because I also brought in the fact that this is a political problem as well, because in the political field, it isn't what it used to be, where all kinds of volunteers went out and worked their butts off for several months to get their favorite person elected. Now, oftentimes these elections are run by paid staff. And that means that loyalty that would normally be felt to the member who's going up there was a real passion because we believe in this cause and we want to make the good things happen for our province and our country and our constituents. It's the same thing as it happens with the chiefs of staff. These guys are just paid, their guns for hire. They come in, they do the job, they follow their own dictates, and off they go. So what frequently happens also is that they will help to re-elect people who have been working in the public service, or in the political service, as say the chiefs of staff or the EA or whatever they want to call them in the province or in the feds. So very, very often, and by the way, we've had some very good public servants out of this. Not all of them are bad. Some of them do an excellent job. I can think of some names that are good. But what happens often is you got a 22-year-old goes in, He now is the keeper of the keys. He knows all the information. He's the smartest guy in the room. The member is just an idiot because you have to tell him everything. And he suddenly begins to puff up and feel that he's more important than the member of parliament or the member of the legislature. And then, of course, they think, well, I can do that job. I'm just as smart as he is. They have no experience. And guess what? It happens all over the place. They run for election.
So just hold on here for a sec, because I think you're using, you refer to EAs. That stands for executive assistants.
Yeah.
Who
every
who are not elected,
names.
and then they work for the MP. And you're saying that because they're helping the member, they gain a lot of knowledge, and then that often puts them in a position where, well, they actually end up running and taking the MP's position. So that's
the
not
MP
healthy
may be
in your
stepping
mind.
down. The MP is stepping down, and by often the MPs help them, or the MLA. So they're stepping down. They say, well, Joe's been a loyal servant for me, and I, think he'd be a great MP. And so, but the problem being that Joe has a better, he hasn't got any real life experience in the public. He doesn't, he's become a little cynical because he sees how things work and he has his own view of how that works. So that cynicism is transferred to the guy when he becomes a member of parliament or a member of the legislature.
So that's fascinating, because what you're saying then is that, well, as a member of the public, we expect that we would elect people from different walks of life to represent our community. But that system, the way it works now, gives an enormous kind of insider's edge to, well, in your case that you're mentioning, executive assistants, and then they become members of parliament. So that's almost all too common. That's a brilliant point. So I think I just want to encourage people to look at the report that you've authored, Dorothy, because it not only goes through how we got here in terms of the challenges that we face in public service, but also solutions. And so what I wanted to do is I'm delighted to also welcome another former member of parliament at the federal level, and his name is Robert Falcon Ouellette. And welcome, Robert Falcon. You were a member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre, representing the Liberal Party from 2015 to 2019. You have a background in administration. You're a captain in the armed forces, and you're an associate professor at the University of Ottawa. So a warm welcome to you, Robert Falcon.
Merci. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, I'm delighted to see you, Robert Falcon, because I know you've had a chance to look at Dorothy Dobbie's report. Does this look all familiar to you as a former member of parliament?
Of course, I was quite struck by what Dorothy had written, and even some of the stories. I think there is, when we talk about the power of MPs, and I was always kind of amazed sometimes about how many members of parliament feel they have absolutely no power, that they're merely spokespeople. And even ministers, you would meet ministers that would be, they would be trying to get a policy forward. They couldn't get it through cabinet, couldn't get it through the four corners, couldn't get it through the Privy Council's office, the Prime Minister's office, or even through past the Chief of Staff to get approval to even make an announcement. And it would be stuff that might even be quite important, but for some reason it was held up, and they had no idea why. And they were just merely just spokespeople. And you see some of the people who become promoted, become ministers, the ones who get move further up are the ones who speak the best. Sometimes it's not about what you know, it's simply about how you say it. And that became extremely important. And I met a number of MPs after one term. They decided, I'm leaving. I've done this for one term. I've had enough. I can go do something real, tangible, have some real influence in life, and just feel useful and important, even in a small way in their field of expertise. And the people who are often elected MPs, not all, but many, are absolutely the top of their field. I've met former generals. I've met people who have been working as translators. In linguistics. I've met people who've worked on Bay Street, and they know the ins and out of their field. even in healthcare, and for them to feel that they have no influence, I found it really sometimes quite disheartening. And I took it to heart, and I said to myself, well, what can I do to be different? You know, how do you make sure you have influence? And Dorothy talked about that idea of someone popping their head up. I pop my head up a lot, and I used to make the PMO's office quite nervous and a few times angry about what I might be saying, because sometimes I just disagreed. And I think Dorothy's right that there are political staff that make decisions that often don't have a lot of life experience, but they make these decisions in the blink of an eye without having looked at all the facts. And one thing I've learned in life, 29 years in the military, working in universities, working on pipelines even, is you need to speak to everyone about an issue. Not don't make a rash decision, because you might make a decision, but you don't have all the facts. And if you don't have all the facts, you might make the poor decision or a wrong decision. It's going to impact people for a very long time. And I often found government was making decisions very quickly on the spur of the moment because they needed to get a message out to the media. And they wanted you to follow along as a member. You know, here's your speech, here's what you're going to say, here's the talking points, go up and say this, and don't go beyond what we've put out here. Anyways, it's always it's always interesting what goes on.
Well, this is a fascinating conversation between you, Robert, Falcon, and Dorothy. I think a lot of Canadians would be shocked to hear this, that there's almost like an element of what we would assume happens with our elected officials, that they are powerful people. And yet I'm getting the impression
Well,
that
they
they've been
can be
disempowered.
powerful. They can be powerful, but often they're not allowed to be powerful. I remember reading about Pierre Trudeau, how he used to think his MPs were just these mere waifs that had no importance. And I think I think he probably talked about that with his son at some point. And it must have influenced him, because I also saw that often. A lot of MPs, they weren't really important. There was, it was really, maybe I'm a little cynical, but at the same time, I used to see what was going on and see how it worked in the caucus. Most MPs, even, the caucus, caucus is a group of the same political party that get together, generally the same political party. And we have every Wednesday morning for a couple hours, we have the opportunity of speaking. Well, most MPs wouldn't even speak at caucus.
No kidding.
And they
So,
wouldn't
like, because
voice their
these are
opinion. And this is your
critical.
minute. This is your chance to have 90 seconds in front of the prime minister, all the ministers, all your cabinet, all your caucus colleagues, to say something of importance impacting your community. I used to try and speak as much as I possibly could, and often I was never denied a speaking opportunity, even though there's 181 other individuals who could have 90 seconds, and because they just don't speak. Because I was talking to some of them after, and they said, "Well, it just doesn't matter, and you might make people mad, Robert." And I was like, "Well, I'm here to make people a little mad, to make them think about my city, my town,
That's
things
something.
going on." Like, we live in Winnipeg. Winnipeg has major challenges. We're not Ontario, we're not big, and we've got a punch above our weight. And we have challenges with homelessness, with addictions. We have crime issues in our city. We have economic development issues, and it's not dealt with in Ottawa because they don't think about us very often. Yet it's more important here because this is the real Canada. Ottawa, and this is the bubble that happens, is a lot of people, these young staffers come in, they start very young in their 20s, out of university often. Bushy-tailed and excited to be there and to follow orders about what they're told to do, and to do it how they've been told by their superiors, and their superiors might not be the MP. When Dorothy talks about the chief of staff, none of the chiefs of staff are hired by the ministers. They're hired by the prime minister's office. For instance, Jody Raybould-Wilson, who eventually left her position in cabinet in 2018, she in 6 months went through 3 chiefs of staff because they weren't doing what she wanted to do. And she was pushing her ideas, making sure that the federal civil services, the justice minister, would respond. And she was ending up in battles with them. And she said, well, I'll just get rid of this person and I'll try and get another one. And the prime minister's office tries to impose saying, well, you have to take the person we've selected.
Wow. Okay, so I want to come back to your comments and I want to come back to Dorothy here.
Mm.
Dorothy, was that always the case in your experience where the chief of staff was never hired by the minister in charge?
It wasn't the case when I was a member of parliament. So this is something that's evolved over the years, and it doesn't matter who started it, although I have a pretty good idea. But it evolved, and one corporate memory is passed on from one government to another, even if it's not the same party. So if one party does it, it gives license to the next party to do the same thing. And then often, and that's the case in Manitoba, it filters down to the local level. So these are practices that should be stopped. I'm understanding, I've asked the question whether or not the Conservatives are able to hire their chiefs of staff. The answer right now is yes, but I hope if they ever form government that won't be changed. And it does, and it did happen here under the Conservative Party in Manitoba, where they had a central hiring agency. So it's not a partisan thing. It's just this is convenient because now, all this information filters through me. I'm the chief, the premier, the president, whatever it is, the prime minister, and I have that power, and I can't trust anybody because everybody's got their elbows out trying to get me. So if I'm the guy that's calling the shots, and I know what's going on in those ministers' offices, that gives me more power. I don't think it's a good idea.
I want to just add something. There is a simple solution. It comes down to this idea of courage. A lot of elected officials, for whatever reason, abdicate their what should actually be happening. I don't understand why so many of my colleagues accepted for so long what goes on around them. And for instance, look at Justin Trudeau. It took him almost 2.5 years too long before he resigned. And that's because my colleagues lacked the courage to say anything to him. Everyone just kind of went along with it. And if you go along with everything and you've been trained to go along with it and you're told, well, just, play it out, look after yourself. Maybe you'll become a minister. Maybe you won't. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, who are you there working for? Are you there working for the prime minister? You're working with. But at the end, also, you have to have a sense that you're actually there for your community. No one is going to speak on behalf of Winnipeg and Winnipeg Center or Charleswood, because you are the expert of your community, or you should be anyways. And no one is going to be standing up in the caucus and talking about the needs of your neighbors, because people elsewhere have other problems. So you need to be willing to take some of the blows. I know some MPs believe that they were all going to have this very long career in Parliament. Most of the time, most MPs are not going to be there for a long time. There's a couple of the outliers that are there for 20 years, 30 years, like Lawrence Macaulay and Prince Edward Island. But at the end of the day, what ends up happening is you're there for 1-2 terms, and then your government's booted and you're done. Well, you might as well be able to, when you're done, look at yourself in the mirror and say, this is what I accomplished. And I had the courage to stand up for my constituents each and every day, and I wasn't afraid.
What do you say, Dorothy?
The other thing that happens is that the minute you get there, you're kind of led to believe that your boss is the prime minister or the premier. And when in fact that's not true. Your boss is your constituents, because they're the ones who have the power to keep you, fire and hire you or whatever. And so, but immediately you've got all these young people running around telling you what to do from the PMO or the premier's office, and they take it very seriously, and they can be very forceful in terms of giving you orders. There's not a lot of respect for the member of parliament.
Well, Dorothy, it's interesting you use the word boss. In fact, actually, that's the nickname we had for Justin Trudeau. Everyone called him the boss. The boss, when the boss makes the decision, we'll do what the boss wants. We'll pass it by the boss. We'll see what happens with the boss. I had an interesting conversation with Bill Casey, who you might remember, Dorothy. He was in the Brian Mulroney's government. But he said his best caucus leader, and he'd been in many, many different governments. He'd been with Stephen Harper. He'd been with Brian Mulroney. And he ended up with Justin Trudeau. at the end, he switched parties. He said his best leader he ever had, most responsive to the needs of his fellow MPs, and this is decades ago, was Brian Mulroney. He said he used to really look after what you needed and listen to you. You sensed that you had a sense of personal power, that you were actually important. And we've gotten away from that. It's quite terrible. And people were loyal to Brian, I believe.
Very loyal to Brian. But he would pick up the phone. If he heard you were in trouble, he would pick up the phone and call you and say, don't worry, it'll all get fixed. Don't worry, we've all been there before. And he would give comfort to people on the other side as well as on his own.
So
And that's an
this
art that
strikes me as
lost.
a fascinating conversation among former MPs who, I mean, both of you, knowing you, to some degree, you obviously ran out of a vision of serving the people, of being the voice of the people. And I thought the last time I checked, the House of Commons was really the House of the people. Have we lost that vision then? Is that what you're saying, Robert?
I think generally that vision has been lost. Yeah. I think the way the political system functions, it doesn't work like that. The theory is it is supposed to be this democratic space where we have these debates, but really at the end of the day, there are so many other factors and there's many other players that are involved in a lot of the decisions. And it comes down to, I think, really the sense among MPs about, how much personal power they have. Nomination meetings are very controlling within the political system. The leader at any time, and this is not like the United States, the way, and I believe Dorothy wrote about this, you can be denied a nomination, even though you've been selected. You could sell thousands of memberships. You could have your community behind you. You could be a very influential person in your community. But if the prime minister's office or the leader's office of the political party decides, we don't want you, they don't need to sign your nomination papers in the election. And you can't run. You're essentially ejected from the party and they will select someone who is more compliant with their will. And this is one of the worst aspects of Canadian democracy because it doesn't give us that freedom in our local community to select the people we want. And they can parachute people in. I've seen EAs, executive assistants, who work for an MP who decided to retire, who'd never set foot in the riding, but they were the EA in Ottawa, parachuted into the riding, and then they become that elected representative. And some of them are safe seats. And the problem is, if you're not from a community, you don't know what the needs are. And you're there to speak on behalf of your citizens, your neighbors. But they're not neighbors. It's a political process, and I'm here to advance a career.
At least as a senator,
if you're just parachuted in, how would you know the community and then be the people's voice? What do you think, Dorothy?
Well, you can. I was going to say, as a senator, you have to own land in the area that you're representing, so that you have to have some familiarity with the people you represented. Why shouldn't we have that for elected representatives as well? People have been parachuted into ridings for many, many years. It's not brand new, but it isn't a good practice, that's for sure.
Okay, so when we look at renewing public service, then I'm hearing not only do we need to renew how the system works around elected officials to empower them, but to also empower the civil servants to do their job as professionals, not as partisans. But it's also the renewal of our parties, our political parties. So when we look at this, then I guess my other question would be, what is the role of the media then in helping to renew this whole theme that we're getting into, is that our public service is broken in this country? Who wants to tackle that question?
The media, really, I'm very disappointed because I'm sort of part of it. And there is not a lot of careful thought going into what the reporting. Reporters have always reported and editorial people have always done the thinking. But the reporters tried to report accurate information. And right now they're just spouting stuff they hear. It's word salads and it's over and over and over the same thing. And I remember, and this happened back even when I was there, being told by a reporter who was very, very well known, when I said, how come everybody is saying this when that's what happened? He said, Dorothy, there's a herd mentality. And if CBC gets it or CTV gets it and the Globe and Mail gets it, if you don't get it, you're going to get kicked out of the newsroom. So that has been exacerbated. And now what we see is the same stuff being mimicked over and over again. And a lot of it is, I have to say it's biased in favor of whoever they think is going to be in power. And I'm not saying it's politically biased. It's biased in favor of power. That's not healthy either.
Interesting. What do you think, Robert?
Yeah, well, the media has a really important role to play, but often, sometimes I want to be kind. I know many people who work in the media, and I think they're generally good people. I don't think people get into becoming a journalist, going to journalism school because they want to make a lot of money. I think most of them do it because they actually have this sense of civic duty. But at the same time, I just think that the media is not encouraging enough education. I don't think they're connecting with enough people in our society. I think people are quite turned off by what they see in social media, but also in the media. I don't think a lot of people understand what's happening, and I don't think we speak to different groups enough within our society. And I don't think the journalists do a good enough job of actually talking about what happens in Parliament and having if you were trying to get into go understand what's going on with tariffs, for instance, right now in the United States, and you hadn't been following, it would be very, very difficult because sometimes people just assume everyone has the same information. But often it's very, very difficult to gain an understanding of a thing when you've been dealing with your own children, you're driving kids to sports practices, you've got school, you've got work, you've got to cook, you've got to clean, you've got all your daily life, and you haven't had this opportunity of really understanding or reading about the news. And the media make it very, very difficult to follow along, which is bad for our democracy. Because, for instance, what is the role of an MP? They used to be quite important in society. They used to write reports that had huge influence on Canadian policy, and we've gotten away from that. It's incredible to think that, for instance, MPs were the ones writing reports on Indian residential schools and setting up policy back in the early part of the Canadian Confederation. I don't think any MP writes any reports nowadays on their own. There's a whole slew of staff. It goes through the PMO's office, and they're going to get someone who's an actual expert or who they want to actually implement those policies. And the MP is just simply seen as a spokesperson. But we don't talk about
It's worse than that. I learned something the other day that shocked pants off me. And that is that in some instances here in the province, for example, they hire a consulting firm to write ministers' letters. That consulting firm also represents, and they're very small, small group, 3 or 4 people, 5 people. They also represent a whole bunch of other interests in the community who are lobbying the government. And who are the keeper of the keys to keep people with all the information? This nameless consulting firm. And I find that absolutely shocking. When you talk about abrogation of responsibility, you've got all sorts of staff. Why can't they write your letters? Why can't they hear what the minister has to say and consult with the minister when the letter goes back, not just send some pro forma thing?
So you're saying, Dorothy, that in this case, you have a consulting firm basically writing all the MP's correspondence.
Well,
so the question is,
if
there's any speech, if there's any public speech, do you get to write your own speeches as an MP?
Well, that's interesting too. I wrote my own speeches, but somebody told me the other day, and I should mention just for your listeners that I was the president of the Canadian Association of Former Parliamentarians. So I hear these stories from all parties and all sides. It's not a partisan thing. And I heard the other day that apparently the practice currently is to offer, when you go into the House, 3 or 4 speeches that you can read from. That those are your choices. Well, that's not how you work. That's you think things through for yourself and you speak from your heart. Some guys turn them down and they just do their own thing, but most people pick up the speeches and read what you've seen them read in the House of Commons, and that's what.
Yeah, those speeches going to confirm, Dorothy. They're prepared by staff on the minister's team. Someone, sometimes not a lot of experience, has been forced to write 3 or 4 of them. And if you're scheduled to speak, you go see the lobby manager, and someone will pop out, print off one of the speeches and say, here, read this off. And I think it's actually quite disheartening. And I think the problem with that is people don't listen to you anymore. No one cares what you say. And because they don't listen to what you say,
you because it sounds like a
you're no
PR
longer
piece.
important. I used to try and read my own speech. A couple times I said, well, ask my fellow MPs, like what happens? Like, do people even listen to me when I'm speaking? And he said, oh, we listen to you because we don't know what you're going to say next on an Indigenous issue. We're all nervous back there on, you can see the minister's office on the seat of their chairs, the white knuckles, like, what's he going to say next? And that's
But
fun.
isn't this incredible that you have people in the public? They would assume that you're our voice, you're the people's voice. And in fact, you're not speaking your own genuine voice. That's terrible, isn't it? As an MP, you must feel kind of, well, disempowered.
I think
I think a lot more. Yeah.
a lot of trouble with that. Yeah. I mean, it's a long time since I was a member of parliament, so I've been away from it, but I'm picking this up from the people that I've been representing. And my heart goes out to them because I said one time to Robert, why didn't you run again? And he said basically what he said to you at the very outset. It's very disheartening, isn't it?
It is. It's also hard to get the nomination. Sometimes you make people mad. They don't want to give you those nomination papers.
Wow.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And then they've got some chosen person who may not be the right person at all. And the one who is right. I mean, I'm not going to go into examples, but I see it all the time where really good potential MPs try to get but somebody has a grudge against them, someone that's in the back room, or they don't like them for some reason. In one particular case, I heard that a candidate was turned down by the PMO on the advice of somebody because they overheard this individual speaking on an airplane. They were listening, and they didn't like what he said. And so after he'd raised all of these memberships and done all this work, he was turned down.
Wow. So this is a common question that I hear, and I'm sure you hear it as well, is people who care about this country say, wow, leadership matters, governance matters, public service matters, and we need good people to come forward and stand for election, to be involved in the political process. But all of what you're saying is that those roles have been disempowered. So why would anyone rationally run for political office? Isn't that the problem?
You have to get involved in your party. You have to get involved, and you have to get other people involved with you. So that when you elect an executive, or you elect the people who run your party, you make sure they're strong enough to impose the will of the party on the process. Because, the party doesn't work for the prime minister or the minister or the premier. The premier works for the party. And they've got that upside down now for some reason. So get involved at the local level and insist that your voice be heard. Question the rules, question the constitutions that they are passing and changing periodically, often for somebody else's good other than yours, and make sure that you try to rescind some of these rules. I mean, there should be real reason if a prime minister or a premier rejects a candidate, or more likely their office or somebody around them, there should be it should be reported. Now look at this just happened with Ruby Dalla, and she raised all this money, she'd done all this work, and then suddenly they just cut her loose, right? And
yeah, that is true. I actually think most people don't want to get involved in the political process because I don't see the benefit. We have so many amazing people in our communities that come from so many different backgrounds, and it's very hard to recruit candidates for many positions. And I'm sure the Liberal Party right now is having that exact issue because people just look at it and say, well, I'm not interested in this, the way this political process works. I'm not interested in perhaps being a mere figurehead. And others, they're interested in because it comes with a salary. They like the travel. They want to try it out, see what it might be, see if they can get promoted. Maybe they'd be a minister, maybe they won't.
But the wrong reasons.
Sometimes I think a lot of people go in it for the wrong reasons. It's quite sad, actually. It's a sad state that we're in. There used to be a time when you could get the Hansard. There was someone that was publishing the Hansard in Canadian society. You could have it delivered to your house, and you could see the weekly speeches. It was like The Economist, and people would leaf through it. I've heard of people in the 70s, reading speeches on the weekend because it was interesting. It was the debates of the day. No one reads the Hansard anymore. No one's interested. We've lost that civic sense, and maybe even that's part of like what goes on in our education system. We don't really promote this within our youth. We don't go out to schools. I'm surprised the number of times I was invited to go to high schools, and I even said, I'll come to your high school if you want. And they said, well, we're not really interested in it. Well,
Yeah.
Used to say to myself, well, how do you inspire youth then to want to do more things for their community and to educate people about what's important, what's going on, if we don't even want to have, even if the teachers don't want to have politicians in their schools. And they could criticize me. I don't mind if you happen to debate with students, but it's important that that youth be exposed to this idea of civic education. And we've become a very, maybe it's just the sign of the times, we're focused very much on our own needs, our own wants, our own desires, and less on the overall needs of our society and this idea of duty and responsibility.
Very good. Dorothy, is that part of the solution?
It certainly has an influence. There is a current member of parliament on the Conservative side who said that she ran because I went to her school when she was in grade 9, and she was inspired. So I think that's an important part of what we do, and I don't understand why people would be turning you down, Robert, especially you, because you've got so much to offer. But what I think really needs is a grassroots. Like everything starts somewhere simple. And it really starts at the party level where people must be involved. You can't just get upset and shake your head and say you're changing the party because you're not happy, or you're starting a new party, which is a great fad these days. I think there's 3 of them in Manitoba now, 3 Conservative parties because they're not happy. That is not the way to go. And I see there's another new party at the federal level. That gets you nowhere. You have to get involved, and we can't have our own way. That's not what it's about. It's about discussing, having opposing views, not being afraid to say what you think, and not not being canceled because you don't agree with somebody else. Healthy debate is what is the basics of democracy.
I think you're spot on. I think that's a brilliant comment about healthy debate. And speaking of your references to tradition and trust and the people's voice, there's a parliamentarian that I think we all look up to, and that was Winston Churchill. And I'm reminded of his quote where he says, I am a child of the House of Commons. I was brought up in my father's house to believe in democracy, trust the people. That was his message. And I owe advancement entirely to the House of Commons, whom I am a servant. In my country, as in yours, public men and women are proud to be the servants of the state and would be ashamed to be its masters. And I think that's a very powerful quote from Winston Churchill, the former prime minister. And I guess my question to you then would be, are we failing our democracy when it sounds like we don't put trust in the people through our elected officials? What do you say, Dorothy?
I say that that's so true. There are always people who think they know better and they know better than anybody else. And I think the only way to find out what the truth is to hear as many voices as you can, not to be angry or not to vilify them. They're not bad people. They just have a bit different opinion. And that opinion is part of that goes into a mix. It makes a better community, a better world, a better political system. And if you don't hear from every voice, you end up with a totalitarian system, and we all know where that leads. So yeah, we need to hear from people, and we need the media to take their responsibilities seriously, to do their homework, to investigate. And there are no investigative reporters anymore. And to get to the bottom of issues, when rumors arise, now they're dismissed by people saying, oh, they're a conspiracy theory. They're not always a conspiracy theory. Often there is a grain of truth somewhere, and it's up to somebody to get to the bottom of it and find out what it is. And then to make sure that those voices, those questions, those issues are raised so that parliamentarians can actually do something about them.
Robert Falcon, your comment?
Well, I just think it really comes back to the education system. I don't think we do a very good job even training teachers. I work at the University of Ottawa, and there is no course that talks about civic duty to our students. We talk a lot about didactic and pedagogy and how to teach the program, but we don't really talk about the importance of the political system, and a lot of the students, maybe they don't even care. And if the people who educate our youth don't care, in future generations, it's going to it might get worse. And we see what happens when things, our people don't care about it. We end up with the situation that we have, and and I know sometimes people think, well, that's how it's always been. It hasn't been like that. Do you want to be run by people that are faceless, nameless, and you don't know who they are, you don't know where they're from, that making very important decisions about what happens in our society? Or would you like the people that you know from your community making those decisions and influencing what happens? That, I think, is the ideal. The question is how to get there. And I think, for instance, a lot of former MPs have a role to play in
Yes.
doing this type of education. That's why Dorothy and me were both involved with the Association of Former Parliamentarians, mandated organization by an act of Parliament. But even us, we don't have the resources in order to do a lot of this work. But at the same time, we have this responsibility because we believe in democracy. We would believe in this the system that we have, that it can be very good for the long-term benefit of more people. And in debate in society is good because it actually makes you get more perspectives, and it might make an idea that wasn't so good a lot better for more people.
Right on. Well said, both Robert, Falcon, and Dorothy. We have a new prime minister in Canada, Mark Carney. If you were to give him advice on how to, frankly, renew our traditions of public service for both elected and non-elected officials, what is one piece of advice would you give them in terms of a solution to our challenges today? Dorothy?
First of all, call an election because he isn't elected, and so it makes him powerless. So he will probably call an election very soon. But then after that, it really takes a lot of thought, and it's not going to be happening something that's overdone or done overnight. To deal with the unions, one of the things you could do is make sure that ministers are responsible and that they are part of the bargaining process so that they can actually have some influence on what happens at the public service level. Give people the right and the opportunity and the responsibility and accountability for using judgment and for using their own judgment. Listen to everybody. And make sure that when you listen, don't come with your own preconceived notions about how things are fixed. Hear what they have to say and act on the knowledge that you've gained because you did listen. Listening is probably the number one, I think, remedy right now for in the short term.
Well said. Robert, Falcon?
Well, I think this is a tough one because we don't really know who Mark Carney is, to be honest. He was we would call him a technocrat or someone who was in the background, but as the governor of the Bank of England or Canada, they're not really permitted to say a whole lot about anything, really. So we don't really know what his philosophy is about life and about politics and about civic duty. But if I had to say something to him, I would ask him to give up power over the nomination process in the communities, to give it back to constituencies, to give it back to the local citizens so that they can select a member of parliament that even if he might not like who that person is they select, that they then that he proposes someone better or works harder. And then the other thing is, I think he needs to be very clear about ministerial responsibility. There are so many qualified people in a caucus. Any one of them could be a minister. If someone's not up to snuff, you've got to, just because they speak well or present well or they're the proper demographic or ethnicity, sometimes you just got to get rid of people and move on. And he should be making sure that that idea of ministerial responsibility is instilled, a very high ethical standard, but people also work hard not to just be spokespersons for their department, but to actually understand what goes on in their department and to seek that consensus within the wider caucus to involve MPs in decision-making. Because what's been going on under the Trudeau government, I think, while he presents very well, I think it was one of the, I would have to say, a very ineffective form of leadership among people who were very well qualified.
Mm-hmm.
And
so
also,
last question to
I just wanted to just add one thing for Robert, which is to stop hiring through the PMO. Let the members of parliament hire their own chiefs of staff.
Well said. My last question to both of you is, do citizens matter? What can we as citizens, as Canadians who care about this country, do in terms of renewing our great tradition in this country of public service? Dorothy?
Well, I've already mentioned the fact that I think that we should, I can't remember what I said before, but we just have to become involved. And I guess that's what I did say. And secondly, I think, as Robert has mentioned, that we could probably utilize the expertise and the experience of former members of Parliament at both provincial and federal level, and even at the civic level, and gain from the old guys, learn from the old guys. When I was in Parliament, the old guys are what kept me going and taught me how to manage the system so that I could at least have some influence and make some things happen. We don't do that anymore. The old guys are shunted aside and they're ignored. We have a lot to offer. And I think that when it comes to moving from one government to another, it's more than just a lot to offer. It's an absolutely essential service that we should be providing to the country.
Well said. Robert Falcon?
Well, I agree with Dorothy. You have to get involved. Sometimes it doesn't take a lot, but if you have a bit of a passion for life in our society, I think you should just join a political party and even try and get on riding associations. And it doesn't really matter which political party you're with. I think they're all good, but get involved with something and have some influence. And I also think people should write their MP more often, write the minister, but write handwritten notes. Don't send an email. The email is only looked at by the staff, who then can, do a form letter and send it back to you and not really address what your concern was, and it might never get to the MP. But a handwritten note, often I used to like looking at them, and I would respond back to them, because if someone took the time to write me a letter, I might write a letter back, and people could have a pretty good influence, because all of a sudden, oh, this is a real person. Might not win you elections or anything, but it certainly gives you more information. It gives you some fuel for the debates that you might have to deal with in the House of Commons, because that's one of the things MPs need. They need people interacting with them so they know what they can say. What are the needs of my community? Not what the PMO tells me are the needs of my community, but what are actually my needs of my people, my neighbor.
Hear, hear.
Well said, and here, to echo Dorothy's comment. And I want to thank both of you, Dorothy Dobbie, as well as Robert Falcon Ouellette, former MPs. And I want to thank you for your service while you were in office, and your service that continues as we talked about the importance of both public service and how to renew it. So thank you for joining us for this conversation today.
Thank you, David.
Oh.